quarterly meeting of the Watertown Historical Society. Tonight we have a really interesting presentation planned for you on the Clyman Street Historic District. Without further ado, we'll get to Mr. Joe DeRose. He works for the Wisconsin Historical Society, and many of you will remember when he talked to us in 2009 about the historic homes on North and South Washington Street. Joe?
Thanks, Melissa. Melissa said, my name is Joe DeRose. I work at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison. I'm a transplanted Chicagoan. I grew up in the Chicago area and moved to Wisconsin in 1990. And when I first moved here, people told me, whatever you do, do not schedule meetings for the opening day of the deer hunting season or when the Packers are playing, because no one will come. You guys have broken the mold. I'm just thrilled.
We scheduled this a long time
ago. We did. We scheduled this back in February. I brought information on our collection. Watertown has a great collection of historic photos on the local website. But at the Wisconsin Historical Society, we also have a lot of historic photos, and this is information how to access those. We have over 80,000 images currently available online. A lot of the information that I have, that I'm talking about Clyman Street, is in a database that we have online. Our website is wisconsinhistory.org. Wisconsin history spelled out as one big word. And my office gathers information on historic resources around the state of Wisconsin. Any history that we've uncovered on the history of buildings, we put in this database. And we have information on about 130,000 buildings around the state of Wisconsin. So a lot of the information that I have here comes from our website. And so I brought these bookmarks that have the web address if you want to learn more about it. So Melissa asked me to talk about the Clyman Street Historic District. This neighborhood was recently listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is the country's official list of significant properties. And the Clyman Street District was listed because it's a great neighborhood of historic homes. I'm going to talk about a lot of the homes in that area. It's roughly bounded by Western Avenue to the north, 10th Street to the east, Station Street to the south, and on the west side by 5th Street. So that's kind of the rough boundaries of Clyman Street. I gave you a little background on the Wisconsin Historical Society. This building's not in the Clyman Street Historic District. This is our headquarters building in Madison. And if you ever feel like an adventure and you want to battle the never-ending construction that seems to be taking place in Madison, please come and visit us in person. I like to refer to the Historical Society as we're one of Wisconsin's best kept secrets. Anytime you watch a show on PBS or the History Channel and it deals with North American history, stick around for the credits at the end and you'll be amazed at how often the Wisconsin Historical Society collections are used. We're pretty well known nationally and internationally, but we seem to be overlooked a lot in our own state. We have an archives that's second to none. We have maps of North America going back to the 1500s. Just last week I was reading the Lewis and Clark diary, one of the diaries that was kept on the Lewis and Clark expedition. We have that stuff, and you can come and look at it. We have a library that has the second largest collection of newspapers anywhere in the United States. Watertown, like a lot of communities in Wisconsin, used to have 2 or 3 local newspapers, a lot of times a foreign language, in this case German. Newspaper was also available historically. We have all those newspapers on microfilm going back to statehood. So it's an incredible collection. We operate a museum up on the square, not for too much longer because we're going to be tearing it down and building a new state-of-the-art museum up on the Capitol Square. So we're going to be closed for a couple years with the museum. We operate historic sites around the state. Old World Wisconsin's probably our most well-known one, but we operate from Madeline Island up in Lake Superior down to Stonefield and Cassville on the Mississippi River and others. We work with school groups. I don't know who came up with the idea to teach Wisconsin history to fourth graders, but it's required. I don't remember anything from last week, much less fourth grade, but so we work with school groups to develop curriculum for fourth graders. We work with over 300 historical societies around the state of Wisconsin. We have a press that publishes books. And then there's my office, which is historic preservation. We work with gathering information on historic buildings and archaeological sites, both underground and underwater. And we enforce local, state and federal preservation laws and programs. So, like I said, the Clyman Street Historic District was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And the reason it was listed is because when you go in that neighborhood, it's like stepping back in time. Most of the buildings were constructed between 1855 and 1928. And when you go in that neighborhood, they're still there. You know, it's a very distinct area. And that's what the definition of a National Register Historic District is. It should stand out amongst other neighborhoods in the community. And all of the building stock in this historic district, it runs the range. Everything that was popular between the 1850s up until the 1920s, you'll find those architectural styles in this historic district. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through kind of chronologically, not every building in the district, but I'll talk about a fair amount of them. And there's a few that really struck me, and I'll point those out. Starting with the Prentice House at 802 Clyman, built 1855. It's an example of what's known as the Italianate style of architecture. The Italianate style was very popular in Wisconsin from the 1850s up until the early 1880s. It's characterized by being very boxy, almost square. Also, they typically have a very shallow, pitched, hipped roof. A hipped roof is a four-sided roof that comes up to a point. It almost looks flat from ground level because it's such a shallow pitch. Italianate buildings have tall, narrow windows with decorative lintels. And then a real character-defining feature are these brackets. They're not structural, they're more ornamental, but they're real character-defining feature. And so this building has all of those characteristics. Architectural styles in Wisconsin, we tend to be a little lagging behind the times architecturally. Like a lot of things, fashion, music, what have you, the trends start on the East Coast and they migrate west, historically. Architecture really is no different. It's just that styles of architecture that were popular on the East Coast, like the Italianate, in the 1820s, 1830s, you don't see them in Wisconsin until the 1850s at the earliest because, hey, we weren't a state until the 1840s, so there wasn't a lot going on here before that. Architecture tends to be a little bit on the messy side. It's very rare to find a pristine example of whatever style of architecture. Buildings transform over time. Italianate buildings typically have very small porches, usually just over the main entryway. And the roofs are supported by very thin columns. Well, this porch goes all the way across the front. It was probably put on in the 1880s, 1890s. The Gamm house was built in 1861 on 6th Street. That's his home on the left, and this is his crockery store on Main Street that he built in 1883. One thing I want you to notice, one of the things I really enjoy about Wisconsin is, at the turn of the century, 1900, Wisconsin was one of the most ethnically diverse states in the country. You name the ethnic group, we had it here. And they all brought their different building traditions with them. So in this part of the state, when you're in counties with a heavy German population, Jefferson, Dodge, Washington, pay attention to this portion of the building, the gable end. This is called brick corbelling. It's basically bricks that kind of, instead of being placed long ways, they're pointed out with the narrow piece sticking out. And this is a very typical Germanic tradition. I don't know why, but whenever you see this, When I saw this picture, I go, I knew a German had built this house because that's typically what we see. This is the Heber Smith house on 8th Street. He owned the Rough and Ready Dam and Milling Company in the 1860s. Here's the dam around 1904. There's the Octagon House in the background. The house itself is what's known as the Gothic Revival style of architecture. It was a very popular style for churches, such as St. Bernard's here in town. A lot of churches tend to be designed in the Gothic Revival style because one of the characteristics is a very steeply pitched roof. Other characteristics of the style, though, are these decorative barge boards. That's a decorative piece at the end of the gate, at the end of the roof there. The porches have been removed from this building, but it would have had very delicate porch work on here. It's a style that you don't see in residences that often, especially from an early time period like this. This is the Cole House on Clyman Street. He built kind of your typical Italianate building, square, tall, narrow windows, brackets, over on 4th Street. And he liked it so much, and when he moved, he built another house here. That's his earlier house in the top left. Later on, the house was owned by the Pritzloff family, and that's their hardware store on Main Street. A lot of these black and white photos that you see, I took these from our inventory, that database I told you about, where we have information about 130,000 properties around the state of Wisconsin. While it's not a historic photo in the sense it's from the 1880s or 1890s, it's historic in the sense that it's 30 years old and it may show a building before it was changed or after it was changed. So you have an idea of when changes took place to a property. The Vebon House on Western Avenue. One of the things, a lot of people focus on the architecture of buildings because that's the easiest thing to see. But every building has a story. And some of these stories are very important to the history of the community. And this is one of them. It's because Mr. Vebon, he was the superintendent of the Watertown schools for several decades. He formatted the educational approach for the community, and this is where he lived. And that's the thing about the National Register. The National Register recognizes places where the events happened or where the people lived, and you can still go and you can still see it. It's different than a historic markers program where you might have a historic marker in a parking lot that said, oh, on this site, the first log cabin was built. You look around and you just see there's the Piggly Wiggly, there's a Walmart. Yeah, there's no sense of history other than this stick. The National Register identifies properties that are still there, and that's the importance of it. Another Italian house is the Coe House, built in 1866. And a lot of times when people research buildings, they focus on trying to find out when was the building built and who was it built for. Good, end of story, let's move on. Well, in this case, the property was owned by Charles McKay. He was the superintendent of the city waterworks from 1900 to about 1930. If you would have just researched who lived here in 1866, that's all you never would have known that story. And I want to stress that, I'm hoping that my presentation tonight kind of gets the wheels turning, makes you start remembering things and stories you've heard. And if you know of information about any of the buildings in my presentation, please pass it on to me. I'm the guy that updates our database. So any new information, send it to me and I'll make sure that it gets in there and either corrects it or hopefully just adds to what we already know. I mentioned how Italian houses typically are boxy with a very shallow pitched hip roof. The Hill House is different. It's a gable roof. A gable example is it's got a pointy roof. It's two sides. This is called the gable roof, but it has all the details you typically see. The brackets, tall, narrow windows, decorative lintels, and again, this porch was added at a later time probably because Italianate buildings would have had very thin, very delicate porch columns. This is more of a turn of the century type porch. And when you see that Mr. Pease died around 1910, I'd be willing to bet that the next owner probably put the porch on. I don't know that for sure, but usually when people buy houses, they update them.
You know, there's a published Watertown historian, Charles Wallman. He lived in that house
Oh, okay.
for many years.
The Schempp house on Clyman, it's what we refer to as a gabled L. It's a vernacular house form. Basically, it's two intersecting gables, and if you looked at it from above, it would kind of look like the letter L or the letter T. Most of these gabled L's you don't find in town because they take up a lot of space. You don't find these in cities very often because the lots are too small. So when you see this type of form, they're usually constructed on the edge of town because the lots were larger. So it's kind of rare to see one of these in town. Mr. Schempp that owned this also owned a department store, was involved with a department store down on Main Street for a number of years. You have a lot of Italianate buildings here in this historic district. This shows what an Italianate porch typically looks like. It's just over the main entryway. The columns are much thinner. They're much more delicate than those big boxes we've seen on those other buildings. That's why we know those are additions, later additions. But this appears to have its original porch still on it. A good rule of thumb for trying to gauge the age of a house is take a good look at the windows. Windows mirror technology. Typically, the more panes of glass you have in a window, the older the house. It's because it was cheaper to make smaller panes of glass historically than it was to make a big pane of glass. So when you see buildings that have 4/4 windows, those are going to be older than buildings that have 2/2 windows or 1/1 window, typically. There's another gabled L. These gabled L's almost always had a porch in this area at one time. So this is obviously a modern addition, but it has all the other characteristics of the Italian style, the tall, narrow windows and the decorative lintels. And another thing that you find on Italian houses are bay windows. Three-sided bay windows are another character defining feature. This is the Wiggenhorn house at 510 Clyman Street. It was built in 1876. Another gabled L is the Ford house on Clyman Street. Very well maintained. And again, the tall, narrow windows with the decorative lintels. More modest house. This house has been altered through the years, but it's the Bunt Rock house on 8th Street, built in 1884. Another one of the Schempp family. Now we're moving into the next architectural style. Architectural styles come into fashion and then they go out of fashion and then they're replaced by something else. So the Italianate style was popular in Wisconsin about 1850 to 1880. Well, the next style that came into fashion was the Queen Anne style. And it was a style that was popular from the 1880s up to about 1910. It's characterized by being very irregular. They typically have a variety of wall materials, different size windows, different shapes of windows. A lot of times they'd have a large porch that would wrap around two sides of the house. Typically large-scale building. In the historic district, this is the only architect-designed house that my office knows of. I know there have to be more because I'm going to show some that it was either a very skilled builder or a trained architect that designed them. If you know who it was, please let me know. But this was designed by O.C. Welling. He was an architect from Milwaukee. Behind the trees is another Queen Anne house, a simpler version, but it still has a large porch, clapboard siding, which is skinny wooden boards that overlap. But up in the gables, you have what are called fish scale shingles. Some are diamond shaped, some are scallop shaped, some are square. But a lot of times you'll have decorative shingles up there.
Queen Anne, the only Victorian with an Italianate or Gothic revival The Victorian?
Yeah, that's all. Victorian refers to an era. It's not an architectural style, although realtors tend to call things Victorian like it's a style. It's an era. So that era encompasses, like you said, Queen Anne, Gothic Revival, Italian. They all fall into that Victorian era. You don't see a lot of Queen Anne buildings constructed out of brick, because one of the character-defining features of this style is a variety of wall materials and textures, but it can be done. This is when I say that, you know, there's other buildings that are probably architect designed or they came out of a catalog maybe or something, but this has a lot of details. It has the decorative shingling here, different size windows. A lot of times they would have stained glass in the top here or leaded glass. The porch appears to be original. Mulberger house on Clyman is another example of the Queen Anne style, probably architect design. This is Mr. Mulberger here, involved in a lot of aspects of Watertown's history. The bank, the Globe Mill were just some of his endeavors. He was on the draft board during World War I for Jefferson County.
You know, his father and two of his brothers were mayors.
Yeah, I came across that. The next style that starts to come in after the Queen Anne style starts to fade is the Craftsman style. And they're kind of getting back to more fundamental things. We see the brackets here, like in the Italian style, but here they're not structural, but they're supposed to appear to be structural. They're very, very large. It's a style that was very popular from about 1910 to 1930s. This is a very early building for the style. This picture looks familiar because Mr. Wertheimer was also on the draft board in 1918, and this is his house, a very nice colonial revival building, and this is the office of the Watertown Grain Company. One of the things I like about architecture is, you know, if you start looking at buildings, you know how they're put together, and it's gonna seem common sense. But, you know, just looking at this building, okay, this doesn't match up, so that has to be over a staircase. So even though I've never been in this building, I would be surprised if it didn't have a dogleg staircase. You know, go up, there'd be a landing underneath the windows there, and then continue up to the second floor. That type of staircase was very popular up until about 1910, 1920. It's not until the teens and 20s that we start getting into the straight run staircases like we have today. It's because back then there was a very strict differentiation of public space and private space. You don't want people looking upstairs where the bedrooms were at. So these houses, especially the larger scale ones, typically have these dogleg staircases to differentiate the public first floor space from the more private second floor. And whenever you see that, you know, it's kind of common sense, but anytime you see that bank of windows, it doesn't match up with anything, well, you know it's going to have one of those staircases. It's probably going to be a very ornate. This is what I was saying about how there's got to be other architect designed buildings in this neighborhood, because this is a very grand building. The King House on 8th Street. One of the things I like about these lumber barons, he was involved with a lumber company, and a lot of times they would use their own residence as a showcase for their wares. It's not uncommon for folks that ran lumber yards to have a variety of woods throughout the interior of their house. Maple flooring, oak flooring, cherry, mahogany, you name it. It would be all showcased in different rooms of the house. One of the things I really enjoy about this one is, even though it's a wooden house, it has these what appear to be stone coins on the edge of the house. They're probably made out of wood. They're not made out of stone. But again, it's to showcase, hey, here's a natural wooden material, but we can make it look like a bunch of different things.
Is that classical architecture?
Yes, that'd be a classical revival style, neoclassical style building. Apologize for the very small picture, but the Kadings were a power couple in Watertown history. The stuff that they accomplished is amazing. One of the real problems I have with American history is women are routinely overlooked in history. It's very hard to find any information on them. But then when you come across the fact that they're both lawyers, they ran their own law firm, that's exceedingly rare in the early 20th century to have a woman attorney. And then to see that she serves as the president of the State Civil Service Commission, State Board of Control, not the husband, but the wife. She's in charge of the State Civil Service Commission. I wonder what she thinks of the newest legislation about getting rid of civil service exams and things like that. But I digress. Tragically, she died in an auto accident in 1925, but it's one of the few homes that we have a good history on both the husband and the wife, and there's another one coming up that's very similar. Another building that was probably designed by an architect, it's another classical revival style building. Remember how I mentioned how small panes of glass can give you an age of a building? Well, this is how they fake it. They make it look old. Whenever you see these 9 or 12 or 16 over 1, that's a 19-teens, 1920s phenomenon. They're trying to make the building look a lot older than it really is. But it's a very well done house. This is the Sproesser house. Again, he was involved with the Globe Mill. Here it is in 1922. The early 20th century has a lot of revival styles of architecture. Architects are starting to look to classic designs for inspiration routinely. And one of the many revival styles that pops up is Dutch colonial revival. And they're very easy to spot because they kind of look like barns. They have these gambrel roofs. Most of the time, the gambrel roof parallels the street. The long side of the house typically parallels the house, but we do get some of these front gabled versions of the style. Another early 20th century building is the Heber house on South 7th Street. This style of building is one of my favorite types of buildings. I love the look of Queen Anne houses, that 1880s to 1910 house. I'd hate to live in one because the insides are usually divided up. Every room had a specific purpose. Plus, since they were designed and built in the 19th century, they typically weren't designed with much indoor plumbing or closets. You get into the 20th century, the type of house that you find are called American four squares. These houses were designed with indoor plumbing in mind, with closets in mind, an open floor plan, things that we kind of take for granted today for houses. It's a relatively new phenomenon, and the four square kind of embodied it. Like the Italian style, they're very boxy, they're very square. They're always 2 stories tall. They always have at least one roof dormer, and sometimes 2, 3, or 4. And they always have a full front porch, a porch that stretches across the front. The reasons they were called four squares is because in pure examples, it's 4 rooms on the first floor, 4 rooms on the second floor. But it's very popular from the 19-teens to 1930s. And like I said, they're very roomy on the inside. This one even appears to have a period garage, which is becoming increasingly rare these days. Another type of building we don't see too much of is another one of these vernacular plain house forms. It's called the cross gable style of house. If you look straight down on this house, it would be square, but the roof comes to a peak with 4 different gables. And it's a type of building style or construction method you don't see too many of in the state. It was pretty rare. And this one is in great shape. It has an interesting brickwork on it. The porch still seems to be very intact. Very well maintained house. I mentioned the Queen Anne style of architecture went from about 1880 to about 1910, but there's still some vestiges of about, this is kind of a hybrid. It has the Queen Anne fish scale, but it also is kind of like a four-square in that it's square, with dormers, and the full front porch. So it's kind of, I mentioned how architecture can be messy, and this is a pretty good example. It's kind of melding two different styles of architecture together. A front gabled house, another vernacular form. You usually don't see this type of house in a town of this size. Front gable houses you usually see in larger cities like Milwaukee because the lots are so narrow. That's the only type of house they could build. So it's pretty rare to find one of these in a smaller town in Wisconsin. In 1919, we have the Nowack house. And a lot of times you'll see, while you won't see pure examples of architectural styles, you'll see where a local builder or contractor will take kind of popular styles and add them to his buildings. These banks of windows are a real characteristic of the prairie style of architecture. You know, Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, Prairie School. But it's 2 stories tall. Prairie architecture is usually low, 1 story, you know, of the earth type. These banks of windows are a real character defining feature of the prairie style. A way that the builders would try to minimize how tall these buildings are is that they would stick the windows right up under the eaves. And a lot of times they'd have this belt course here to kind of make the second floor look smaller, shorter than it actually is. It's a way of making the building look shorter than it actually is. Bowen house is another one. It's got some 4-square details. It's got some colonial details like over the door. It's got a bunch of different stylistic influences happening. Here's another one of these Dutch colonial houses I was mentioning, those ones that had the gambrel roof, the ones that look like, you know, like a barn roof. This is the other house that I mentioned, the Thawer House on South 5th Street. Another one where we have a very good history of the life, of what she did. And nowadays, you know, when we read that, you know, she started working in the company in the 1920s and was the president of the company until 1953, we may not think too much of that. But think about what was going on in the 1920s. How it is extremely rare to have a woman running a company. It just doesn't happen. And here in Watertown, you have one of the rare examples. It's a very interesting story. And otherwise, it's a very modest house. You wouldn't think twice if you drove by this, but it has a fascinating history behind it. This is kind of the prototypical American 4-square, those ones I mentioned that were almost perfectly square, with the hipped roof, the dormer, the full front porch. If you look up a photograph of what a 4-square looks like, these are them. This is a very pure example of it. This building has, it's built in 1926. The prairie style was popular from about 1910 to 1930. It's not a pure example of prairie architecture, but it does have the bands of ribbon windows that you see on both floors. Real character-defining features. Prairie architecture also a lot of times will have geometric patterns with concrete or stone on the building. There was a style of architecture that was popular from about 1910 to 1940. It was called the Colonial Revival style of architecture. They were going back to our colonial era roots. And this house, the Meadows house in Clyman, this house could have been built last year. They're still building these. A lot of times you don't find them made out of brick like this, but the side gable form, central entry. This is when you start having the straight run staircases up to the second floor. It's a house type that has been around for decades, and like I said, they're still building these today. So that's kind of my overview of the Clyman Street District. Like I said, it was listed in the National Register. It has about 4 dozen buildings. in the neighborhood that are listed on the National Register. If you want to learn more about what the National Register is and what it means to property owners, you can look on our website. We have information on there. But I want to thank you for coming out tonight. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. But, thanks for having me.